Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Robin Quinville. Robin is director of the Wilson Center's Global Europe program. She joins us today to discuss all things Europe. And Robin, first I'll start. Welcome back. You are
thank you.
An old hand here at the center, but new to the current position. And Robin, I should tell you, has a very distinguished career in diplomacy, both overseas and at the U.S. State Department. And when at the State Department, you were the State Department fellow stationed here at the Wilson Center.
That was an awesome experience, and I really thank the Wilson Center for having me then, and I'm really glad to be a part of the Wilson Center now.
Well, we're thrilled to have you back in this position, and what a time to be in this position. You know, I also want to tell our viewers that as we sit here and record today, this is the day Boris Johnson resigned his post as Prime Minister. And so let's start with that headline.
Let's start with that.
Now, we don't know the details. Will he hang around until October? Will he be out the door sooner rather than later? All of that to be determined. But let's at least rewind the tape and tell us, how did Prime Minister Johnson get to this moment?
This has been a trajectory that's taken place actually over the last month, but even longer than that. In fact, I see this as part of the whole Tory party discussion about where they will go in the post-Brexit era. It started, in a sense, before that. The Brexit referendum was to try to put this question to bed once and for all. Boris came into office to get Brexit done, and he did that, but the pandemic immediately hit. This was always going to be a tough time because now is when some of the consequences of Brexit need to really be grappled with in an environment when we have rising inflation, we have the challenges posed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the impact on energy supply, and the pandemic.
Well, when it rains, it pours.
Yeah.
I mean, historic moments. These are not just minor blips.
So all of them difficult to deal with for any government. But Boris's governance has been hit by a number of issues that have really challenged the perception of him by his own parliamentary party and by the public. So, for example, there was a long investigation into revelations that during the pandemic, during lockdown, Boris and his team nevertheless gathered together and had parties. And there was a whole investigation and then a police investigation because these lockdown regulations were stricter than here in the United States, and they were very limiting for people. So the contrast between having a party at number 10 Downing Street at a time when people weren't able to see their relatives, that was hard.
Yeah. So ultimately, is this a case of just a restless electorate who wants more in terms of managing inflation or keeping taxes low, or is it about the scandals, or is it hard to slice and dice?
It's about the parliamentary party and the parliamentary conservatives who look at this, who see this scandal and then another and then another. The latest was one where he appointed someone to a government position who had a history of salacious scandal behind him. And in fact, the parliamentary party looked around and said, wow, we're not sure we're going to be able to get elected. That prompted a no-confidence motion at the beginning of June. Boris seemed to survive that, but many thought days might be numbered. And in fact, after losing 2 by-elections, also in June, I think that the knives were out. And in fact, the parliamentary party decided they were not going to be looking ahead to winning, and
so stop the hemorrhaging.
Yeah, and also there was a question. There's a question of how the Tory party is going to go. In which direction? Is it for more tax cutting and more free trade orientation, or is this something that is for a more interventionist government? So there's also that debate, but it's masked by the proximate causes of some of this.
Does this result in government paralysis, at least for a period of time?
I think it will be harder to work. Now, Boris appointed some new ministers, and so it is not that there is an absence of ministers in government. And the important point there is that yesterday it was more than 50 ministers and sub-ministers had actually resigned from the government. So he's put new people in place. But there's a process that has to take place to choose a new leader of the Tory party. And I think right now it's not entirely clear how long that will take. Normally it would take perhaps until the next Tory party conference in October, but it seems that there's a real push to try and speed this up, to have the parliamentary party take its choice, and then it could go to the Conservative Party members. But I think there's a push for speed in that, so we may see that take place a little earlier.
Is there confidence from the US, NATO, the EU, that the UK's commitment to supporting Ukraine will continue in a seamless manner, or is there a possibility of disruption there?
I would say that will continue, and here's why. This wasn't a discussion over UK foreign policy. This was an internal discussion about Tory party direction. And so of course, the institutions of government remain in place. As this election for a new Tory party leader goes forward, it may be harder for the UK government to get some things done, but at the same time, I don't think that will affect its effectiveness on the foreign policy stage.
I looked at a BBC report just before we sat down and saw that Vladimir Putin has weighed in and saying essentially, gleefully, as the headline said, that he hopes for a more professional government or prime minister in the UK who will be engaged responsibly in dialogue. So Putin not missing an opportunity to jump on this moment.
I think that is a little rich.
Yeah. So about the invasion of Ukraine, we for good reason look at the suffering in Ukraine and look at the dire circumstances that nation and its leader faces. But get us inside the head of Europe, the larger Europe, and how serious do they see this as a new era of potential Russian expansionism? And what has been the impact on thinking? Has it unified the EU in ways that it was struggling to become unified previously?
I'll start with the impact, which was mega.
Yeah.
For countries like Germany, which conducts its foreign policy, and your viewers may know that I was our chargé d'affaires in Germany, so I will take that example that I know best. This was an extraordinary moment. It was a violation of every international norm. It was a violent invasion. It was something that was, for them, unprecedented. Now, folks will say to me, well, Robin, what about Crimea? Crimea was a more isolated case, and the world reacted in 2014 with sanctions, but they felt that they had this in a manageable spot. This was a full-on invasion of a country, and they looked at this and said, this is a change of behavior that it violates every norm we stand for. So in all of these countries, there was an absolute recognition that this was a new era. Germany said it and took a number of measures to deal with that, but also for the countries in Central Europe, this was something that they had long worried and feared, and it was taken as an example. So suddenly you have countries like Finland and Sweden saying, right, let's rethink decades of our foreign and security policy, and let's apply for NATO membership. And all of this is happening at a time when the structures of multilateralism are actually predetermined to have a lot of discussions in the course of this spring and a lot of coordination. So you had already on the books the fact that you were going to have an EU summit, a G7 summit, and a NATO summit. And in the run-up to this, all of that gave real leverage for planning and consultation and ability to work together. So I think it had the opposite effect that Putin had planned. It was a unifying factor, and these organizations and the countries of both Europe and the alliance.
And has resulted in NATO expansion.
That's right, in NATO expansion, but also the European Union inviting Ukraine and Moldova to join. So all of these are real signs that they have said, right, this is a change. We are going to respond to it in a strong and unified manner.
You know, we began by talking about the list of bad luck and maybe bad choices Boris Johnson made along the way. One of those that has affected the entire planet is the pandemic.
Right.
Give us the update on how Europe is doing in terms of COVID-19.
I think, like here, many countries have relaxed the measures, and of course, it has been a sea change with the vaccinations, and also now with the possibility for some treatment. So restrictions are relaxed, but we're all looking ahead, because in the fall we know that as people move indoors, that offers the opportunity for spread. But I think that we've come to the point where most countries of Europe, and you do get some spikes and declines and so forth over time, are living with it, and just as we're living with it here. And
are vaccination rates remaining high?
Yeah, vaccination rates have stayed high in the countries where I've paid attention to this.
Yeah.
They have remained, and many people have had multiple vaccinations, and so I think that it is no longer the terrifying unknown thing where you didn't know whether going outside could kill you. It is now something where there is a possibility of vaccination, and people have gotten those, whether that's 2 or 3 or 4. There is a potential treatment, and the virus itself has changed in its strength. So I think that now what Europe is looking at is how do the countries of Europe try to work on global health overall, and to prevent the spread of this pandemic, and to try and take measures for countries that are less able to deal with the pandemic, and make sure that they are sharing their knowledge and expertise. And that was something that was discussed also at the G7 summit in Germany.
As we continue our All Things Europe discussion, can you provide us with an update on how European economies are faring in this moment of runaway inflation and real concerns about another significant global economic dip?
I think every country in Europe is focused on what this means for their domestic policy, because they know that as they try to ensure energy supply without Russian sources, as they shift to perhaps LNG, building the terminals for LNG, as they look elsewhere for that, you have seen these prices rise. I think 2 or 3 days ago, the German chancellor gave his famous summer interview. It's like the close of school business before vacation. And the interviewer asked him the price of several foods to see whether he'd gone shopping recently. Fortunately, he had. But it was a sign to show, do you know that the inflation is affecting the price of foodstuff for the average consumer? And I think this is what many governments are going to be focused on. What do they do to try to improve supply chain flexibility, ensure food security, and that includes how do they possibly get food exports from Ukraine, grain exports from Ukraine, which are so important, not just for Europe, but for global food security, because there will be knock-on effects if you don't take account of that as something that is going to come in the future.
Yeah, we're certainly the knee bone connected to the shin bone. It all
right.
cascades. So then I'll segue from specifics about the economy to politics, the political scene overall. The discussion prior to the invasion of Ukraine was all about the rise of populism globally, not just in this hemisphere or just in Europe, but just about everywhere. Has that dynamic changed in the wake of Russia's aggression in Ukraine?
I wouldn't want to say that it has even lessened or disappeared. I will say that as governments focus on this and how to deal with these economic consequences, it will be important to ensure that they're bringing their people along with them, because otherwise you could get those kind of economic dislocations that would feed into a populist narrative. I think we should keep in mind that France has had 2 elections in the course of this spring, first for president and then second for its parliament. And there you see the fracturing of politics to some degree, that yes, President Macron was re-elected against the challenger Marine Le Pen, but that was by a lower margin than you might have anticipated a few years ago. And again, in the parliamentary election, he now has a much more fractured parliament to deal with, and doesn't have the majority that would have enabled him to govern easily.
I use the term political paralysis in asking you a question about the UK. Commentators are using that term in describing the circumstance in France.
Yeah, and I think it's too early to know exactly how that will play out, because the elections were only in June. They're forming their government, but it's something to watch. And if the concern is, if there's ineffective government, what will that mean, both on the international scene, but also on the domestic scene, for the way that politics plays out in the future? What you saw in France was a strengthening of the extremes, both left and right. So what will that mean in the future? Now, in Germany, when you saw the right rise a few years ago, it also has declined to some degree, but not as much as some might hope. And so you really want to watch that in the course of looking at what the economic effects
Still
are.
in flux.
Still
we
in
can't
flux.
draw conclusions yet. So how solid is the union in the wake of Brexit? Well, Brexit was the story, but so much has pushed it from the headlines, even though it's not fully resolved yet in terms of all the detailed negotiations between the UK and the EU. But how solid is the EU in the wake of Brexit?
I would say it's very solid. For one thing, as Brexit went forward, there was a real determination that, okay, we are going to negotiate an agreement that shows that we are standing by these principles. So there was not a lot of flexibility on core principles which unite them. And it's easy to underestimate the degree to which those countries are knit together by regulation and legislation that aligns their policies and regulatory policy, which is so important, and allows for a robust economy between them. So, in fact, I would say they are extremely united. And you saw this in the outcome of the EU summit, with the invitation to both Ukraine and Moldova to become candidates for the EU.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is a sign of unity, because you might not have had that before. So, in fact, more united, a stronger show of strength. And I think that is one of the outcomes of the Brexit debate now.
So I've asked you a lot of questions, Robin. Now I want to ask you the big open-ended one about,
no.
What else are you tracking? What are some of the things we haven't talked about that you'll be looking at, that maybe the Global Europe program will be creating events around?
Oh, okay. Of course, all of these themes that you have outlined are themes that will continue, right? What I'm going to look at is, first, how the results of the NATO summit are implemented, because the EU has written its new strategic compass, and that it was a planning document that is the attempt to assess the threat environment that they are in, the challenges ahead, and to strengthen some of the tools that they have for this. NATO approved its new strategic concept, and both of these documents are looking at and seeing the greater threat posed by Russia, and for NATO, it's the first time that they addressed China in their strategic concept. So NATO took some bold decisions. How are they going to implement them? How do countries step up to the plate to do that implementation? That'll be important for Europe's security architecture, but also for what they are delivering on aid for Ukraine and so forth. So that's going to be important. Do they keep that strength? Do they implement all those promises? Do they support Ukraine, and how? Not only with what is being provided in terms of military support by countries individually, but also for reconstruction assistance. Just this week, we had a meeting in Lugano that was dedicated to infrastructure and rebuilding for Ukraine, and they adopted a set of principles for that. How do they go forward? How do the European countries and we go forward to do that kind of reconstruction and infrastructure support? So much to watch in Europe.
Fun and challenging. And Robin, in a time that is trying and complex, we need context and we need analysis. Thanks for providing that today.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thanks for having
And
me.
great to have you back at the Wilson Center. Congratulations.
I am the happiest person here.
Our guest has been Robin Quinville. If you'd like to hear more about the Global Europe program, come to wilsoncenter.org, and under the Programs tab, you can find the Global Europe program. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for everyone at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thank you for your time and interest.